audio rolling? Is the camera rolling? And we're ready to go.
Looking back at life in Waterford in the 1950s, I was a young guy growing up, short pants, and we were living in the middle of town. And really, Waterford was a very depressed place. People found happiness all right, but they were very poor. And there was terrible slums, and people lived in small houses, big families in small little houses, very bad sanitation. And we had no TV. We barely had a radio. The radio was a colossal big wooden set. It was a piece of furniture, and not even every house had them. And if you had a radio in your car, it was an extra. It didn't come with the car. You had to buy it as an extra. And I remember we had no, obviously, transistor radios. And an uncle of mine from America very kindly sent me a transistor radio from America. This would be in the middle of the 1950s, say 1955 or thereabouts. And I felt I was marvellous. I was the only one in Ireland, as far as I was concerned, that had a radio this small. The only problem was the batteries were small as well, like the batteries that we're used to nowadays. We didn't have those in Ireland in those days. You couldn't get them anywhere. All we had was those great big batteries that you put in torches and bicycle lamps. And of course they wouldn't fit in the transistor radio. So I ran out of the batteries he sent me, and my transistor radio was fairly useless until much, much later when transistor radios became popular anyway. But let's get back to the 1950s and thereabouts. We all went to the pictures. That was our favourite form of entertainment, almost our only form of entertainment, except from playing sports and games and things like that. But nighttime and evening time, matinees and so forth, we went to the pictures. And I want to take you through the various picture houses. And you know what? We didn't even call them cinemas. We called them picture houses. Terminology like movies and cinemas, they weren't really used that much. It was a picture house, we called it. And the first one that came to Waterford, was built in Waterford, was the Coliseum. The Coliseum was located opposite where the Great Western used to come in and out. It's called Adelphi Quay. Now there's all kinds of Adelphi Wharf and so forth there now, behind the present-day Tower Hotel. And the Great Western used to come in Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. And it brought people, a lot of people emigrating, unfortunately, and it brought goods and cattle and so forth over to Fishguard. So that was our ship, and that pulled in just opposite to where the Coliseum was. Originally, it wasn't the Coliseum at all. It was built in 1910 as a skating rink for roller skating. And roller skate hockey was popular, obviously, in Waterford at that time, and they used to have it there. But the popularity waned, and they ceased to be a skating rink, and they made it into a cinema for silent films, only silent films, in 1913, and it became the Rink Picture Palace, hard to pronounce, and then by 1915 or so, they changed it to the Coliseum. But of course, Waterford people are great at putting their own names, so it wasn't the Coliseum for long, it was the Coll. In fact, it was called the Rink. I remember in my youth, people used to say, I'm going down to the rink. And it was a very popular place because, particularly at the weekends, Saturday matinees and that, they always had action films. And we youngsters loved action films. We loved, especially the cowboy pictures. We wouldn't have called them westerns now. They were cowboy pictures. And we followed the cowboys. And in fact, they had so many cowboy films on, they began to call it the Ranch. So it had all kinds of names on the Coll. But the Coll was the most used name for the cinema. And it was by no means a deluxe cinema. It was a one-story building, and it was sort of mecca for a lot of us, particularly on a Saturday afternoon, to go to the pictures and to see a cowboy picture, mainly a cowboy picture. We also saw Tarzan and Robin Hood and all those kind of things. And then, of course, there was the serial. There was a serial on, and that was called The Follower-Upper. And you went to the follower-upper, and at the end of one, there was probably 15 episodes in a serial. So you went for 15 weeks to see how the good guy, and incidentally, the good guy was the chap. So that was another name. And in the cowboy pictures, the good guy always wore a white hat, except for Hopalong Cassidy. He was a good guy. He was a chap, but he wore a black hat and black shirt and jeans. That was an exception to the rule, and we loved Hopalong Cassidy. In fact, he was, I think, my personal favourite. Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and those Rex Allen, Tex Ritter, they all sang. They were singing cowboys. And, we kind of said, cut the singing out and get on with the action. We were action men. But that was the Coll, and we loved it. And it's famous for the fact that it was probably the only cinema in Ireland that had a woman manager. And she is the famous Miss Kerr, known to everybody as Miss Kerr. And she was made even more famous by Brian Nolan. No, it isn't Brian Nolan, it's Jim Nolan, his brother. Jim Nolan wrote a play called The Gods Are Angry, Miss Kerr. And of course the gods, particularly on a Saturday afternoon, the gods were always angry, and she and her usherettes had to try and keep the peace because the kids got rowdy, and they kicked up a stink if they were bored, and then they cheered like Billy-O if the cavalry were coming to the rescue. And so there was always an excuse for noise. I heard also there's awful divilment people got into. The poor Miss Kerr, she was known as Olive Oil because those of us who followed the cartoons, Popeye the Sailor Man, who grew strong on spinach, he had a girlfriend called Olive Oil, and everyone has felt that Miss Kerr, who looked a bit like Olive Oil, so they called her Olive Oil, and that was another thing that happened there. But anyway, during the movies, they came up with all kinds of ideas. Fellas went in there from school with their duffel bags, and inside in the duffel bags they had hidden pigeons. And they got bored of the picture, and they let the pigeons out during the film. And the pigeons were running around, and of course, attracted by the light on the cinema screen, they flew towards the screen. And Miss Kerr had to order the projectionist to stop the film. Lights were brought up, and they saw, I don't know how many, but we'll say half a dozen pigeons flying around the cinema. So what they did then was they opened the doors, the fire escapes and all the rest of it, turned off the lights, and the birds were attracted by the light outside because it was a matinee, and they flew out, and then they started the film again. But that's just an example of the awful things that people got up to, and the poor Miss Kerr. She had a doorman. I suppose you'd call him a commissionaire now, but in the Coll days he was the doorman. And no matter who he was always known as the sheriff, because he was the man who was called in when things really got rough with the audience. He was brought in to try and sort things out. And the gods would be about fourpence in old money to get into a matinee. And sometimes even the kids in those days couldn't find the fourpence and had to do odd jobs and that. There was also, during the war years, I'm going back a little bit further now, back to the 1940s, jam jars were very scarce. So if you bought jam or marmalade, you were expected to bring back the jar and trade it in before you got another one. And if they would scout around, if they found jam jars around the place, they'd bring them along to the Coll, and the Coll would take the jars. If a jar, a 2-pound jar, was worth 2p, then 2 of them would get you in. You didn't even have to have the money. They took the jars. The next place running about the same time was the Theatre Royal. Now the Theatre Royal is part of City Hall, as we know, and had been there for a long time, since the 1700s. But the theatre was leased out by the corporation to various people, and they put in the projection equipment for having silent films there. So they had regular theatre, and then if there was nothing coming, they'd have films. So they had both going. And the manager of the Theatre Royal was called Doc Manahan, and he was the father of the famous Des Manahan, who we all know and love here in Waterford. His father was called Doc Manahan. You'd think he was a doctor. No, he wasn't. He was the seventh son. And there's a tradition in Waterford, certainly, that if a seventh son is born, that he's meant to have special healing powers. So he was the seventh son, he was called Doc Manahan. And he was a great musician. He was actually in the band, the orchestra in the Coliseum. The Coliseum had its own 10-piece orchestra because, you see, the films were silent, so they had to have an orchestra there to, I suppose, take away from the dead sound. And they had a live orchestra, and Doc Manahan was a percussionist. He played the drums, in other words. So he knew about the Coll, and then when the Breens took a lease of the Theatre Royal, they brought Doc Manahan over and made him manager of the Theatre Royal. And the first talkie movie, the first talking film in the world was Al Jolson in The Singing Fool, and that was shown in Waterford, in the Theatre Royal in Waterford in 1928. But we still had a lot of touring companies in those days. Hilton Edwards and Micheál Mac Liamore, Anu McMaster, Cyril Cusack, Lord Longford brought his people, and the Globe Theatre, Carl Clope, Louis Dalton. And then we had the comedians too, Jimmy O'Dea and Maureen Potter, Jack Cruz, our own Hal Roach. And then we had opera, and Waterford people, as you know, love their music, and there was plenty of opera in the Theatre Royal. But in the 50s, the lease ran out, and about the mid-50s or so, the Breens, who had the lease of the Theatre Royal, decided not to renew the lease. And the city manager of the time was a man called Liam Raftus, and he decided that as we have this big building, we'll turn it into offices. Sacrilege, absolute sacrilege, and everyone got up on their high horses about it, and a committee was formed to rectify this situation, and a friendly society was set up to lease the Theatre Royal and to use it for plays and so forth. And the very first play that went on there was Cyril Cusack in the life story of Roger Casement. And of course then we had the Light Opera Festival, the wonderful Light Opera Festival that ran for 50 years. We had Tops of the Town, we had Phelan a Skull. All these things happened in the Theatre Royal. And there was actually two other theatres in Waterford at that time. Well, one at that time and one a bit later that you know about. The Municipal Theatre, the large room in City Hall. It's now the large room in the City Hall, but in those days it was actually used as a theatre. And amateur societies came in and strutted their stuff in there as well, in the same building alongside the Theatre Royal. Now it's gone back to being the large room and is used for recitals and meetings and so forth. And then later on, when the Society of Friends, that's the Quakers, moved out to Newtown and gave up their meeting rooms just off O'Connell Street, it was taken over and converted into a theatre, which is now Garter Lane Theatre. But that wasn't there at that stage. But the Breens had got very much into the whole idea of having cinemas. The Breens were, Martin Breen particularly, was an entrepreneurial type here in Waterford, and they built a cinema up in the Glen called the Regal. It's now the Forum. And the Regal Cinema was, they knocked down an old bacon factory there, Matterson's bacon factory, and built the cinema there. And it was the latest thing ever in cinemas as far as Waterford was concerned. And it was opened in February 1937 with great pomp and ceremony. The first film shown there was The King Steps Out, which was a musical. And incidentally, Doc Manahan was made manager of that as well. So when the Breens had Doc Manahan running the Theatre Royal, they probably said to him, you're doing a good job there, now you can run the other one as well. So he's running both of them. And they had their cinema, their films, and they also had serials, like in the Coll. In fact, as they owned or had the lease of the Royal as well, they used the same serial in the Royal as in the Regal. It might be shown before the films in the Regal and after the main films in the Theatre Royal, or vice versa. But now, when television came to Ireland and life got different, people went to different things, went to different places for their enjoyment, and popularity of the cinema began to wane. And the result was that business got poor. Pubs got better, for instance. Women went into pubs. They used to go into pubs very much. Pubs were kind of sawdust on the floor kind of places. And now they became much nicer lounge bars, a lot of the time with music and so forth. And so it was a new way of going out. And of course the TV on top of that. Popularity of the cinema began to wane, and by 1970 the Regal became less of an attraction, became a bingo hall, and eventually became the Forum. The Savoy, so the Regal was opened early 1937. The Savoy, in the middle of Broad Street, very much commandeering Broad Street, where Supermax now is, and the book centre. The Savoy was opened in December 1937, and that had, the Regal had 1,500 seats, the Savoy had 1,300, slightly smaller, but it was a very plush cinema. It had what other places didn't have. It had its own restaurant. Practically the only restaurant in Ireland, in Waterford. If you rule out the restaurants in the hotels, I can't think of a restaurant in Waterford in those days. Okay, there were cafes and things like that. But see, the bars, for instance, did not serve food. That's a development that happened later on. So they had a restaurant, and a very nice and good restaurant. It was a big treat to be brought to the restaurant in the Savoy. And you could go there, whether you were going to the pictures or not, you go to the restaurant, obviously. Another thing that the Savoy had, it was continuous performance. So you could go in at 3 o'clock to the first house, and they didn't empty it at 5:30. You could stay on and see the second, and sometimes even the third. Sometimes we could see it 3 times. But certainly you could. And if you were late for the 3 o'clock, supposing you couldn't get in until 4:30, a lot of people went to the pictures and came out when they got around to where they came in. So this was it. And Rosemary was the first film shown there. Nelson, Eddie and Jeanette MacDonald were it's a musical, and the proceeds went to the Ballybricken church fund, the building of a new church at the time in Ballybricken. Then the final cinema built around that era, the 1950s that I'm talking about, was the Regina on Patrick Street, 1,500-seater, the lap of luxury. O'Brien's Model Bakery was there, and that was knocked down. And this was another Breen enterprise. And on the 1st of April, 1957, they opened with High Society, that great musical High Society. And they too had continuous performances. They didn't have a restaurant, but they did have continuous performances. And after some time then, a Dublin company called Ward Anderson bought into it and eventually took it over and converted it into a three-screen cinema. And there was the Palace, the Mini, and the Pullman. And that was the place to go to. So that kind of brings us up to date to modern times, and the rest you know yourselves.
Brilliant. Is that the cinema now that's still standing on Patrick Street, or is that a different structure?
That's the same structure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And would you have any recollection or information on the rink that would have stood used first in the
Yeah. The Coliseum. The rink became the cinema, and it closed down in the 1960s. Again, as I say, television era came in, and it was bought by the Waterford Harbour Commissioners, the Harbour Board, as a store. I mentioned that it was close to the shipping and everything like that, so they used it. They took the lovely floor out of it, the maple floor out of the Coliseum, and they used it for flooring their own offices, which were on the lower floor of the Chamber of Commerce building. And they saved the floor for that because they put in an old cement floor, I suppose, as a store. And it was a store for quite a while, and then went to somebody else had it then when the Harbour Commissioners were finished with it, and then it was sold off to McInerney's, who were building the Adelphi Wharf suites and all that development there. So it was knocked down.
Okay. And what year again, sorry, did you say that the Coliseum was established?
It was built in 1910
1910.
as the rink, and then by 1913 it became a cinema, and in the 1960s it ceased to be a cinema, it became a store.
Okay. And would you have any information on the rink that stood there before that? Was that like the roller disco thing, or was that a separate?
It was for playing hockey. Yeah, naturally. Well, it wasn't ice; it was roller skates on the floor.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
okay.
And there were teams around Waterford that played against one another there. But
all systems go.
the first railway came to Ireland in 1834, and it ran between Dunleary and Dublin. Dunleary was called Kingstown in those days, and that was the first railway ever in Ireland. And the architect and builder of that was a man from County Carlow called William Dargan. He was a brilliant architect. And in February 1853, they decided to build a train between Waterford and Tramore. Well, correctly, they had decided a little before that, and they got the Act passed, because in those days, under British rule, you had to get permission of the British Parliament to build a railway. And don't forget, these were all privately owned railways. Now, this wasn't nationalised railways. So a group of business people in Waterford, great people, visionaries, decided that they would build a railway between Waterford and Tramore. And they engaged Mr. Dargan to do the building, and he commenced in February 1853. And it's 7 miles long, and he finished it in 7 months. A fantastic achievement, given that they had no JCBs in those days. And the station in Waterford City was at Manor Street. The only relic of it now is that it's still called Railway Square. When you're going out Manor Street from the lights on the left-hand side, you'll see little wooden children's boats, red and green, not boats, trains, and that's the only sort of reminder that this was the site of a railway station. The actual railway station, a beautiful building, was knocked down in the 1970s when the railway line was closed. I don't think it should have been knocked down, quite frankly. The one in the other end, the one in Tramore, was not knocked down. In fact, it was preserved. It was made the preservation order was put on it, and it's now being purchased by the council, the city and county council as we have now, and they're going to turn it into a museum and town hall and things like that, which is good. And it's a pity that wasn't done in Waterford. I presume they felt it was in the way in Waterford. It's It would have been where the Odeon cinema is now. Roughly there is where the railway station was. And the train ran between Waterford and Tramore. It took about 15 minutes to go, and it was the making of Tramore. Tramore was a small little village and beautiful beach, so this gave people a way of going to the Strand in Tramore for a swim or holidays or whatever like that. Don't forget there were no cars in these days. We're talking about 1853. And also people began to reside in Tramore, live in Tramore permanently and go in and out in the train. So for 11 years after that, from 1853, Waterford had just one station. That was the one in Railway Square. It was a unique line in many respects. It was the only broad gauge railway in all of Ireland, and of course, don't forget other railways were being built all over Ireland at that time, but it was the only one that wasn't connected with the rest. You couldn't get on the train in Tramore and go to Dublin, for instance. You got on the train in Tramore and came to Waterford, and then you had to walk across the city to one of the other stations to go on from there. So it was standalone. This meant that it had to look after its own affairs, like keep its engines running. So they had 3 locomotives. This is the steam era we're talking about now. 3 locomotives. One was in action, one was in reserve, and one was being overhauled. So that's the way they ran. And they ran for 71 years extremely profitably. They made a profit, and that's unknown in railway language nowadays. Railways are all losing money. They made a profit. People were poor. Wages probably weren't great, but they made a profit, and they paid a dividend to their shareholders, these great people who put their own money in and invested and built it and paid for the building of it. They paid a dividend of 5% every year. Some exceptional years they might pay 7%, but they always paid at least 5%, and it was a great success, and people loved their train. But come 1925, the government of the day, don't forget now, the government had changed. We no longer had the British ruling it. We now were the Irish Free State. And the government of the day decided that they'd have to do something about all the railway lines in Ireland, or more accurately in the Free State, in the 26 counties of Ireland, that were losing money. And they decided that they'd have to do something about this, and they passed an act that had the effect of amalgamating all 25 railway lines. These were all privately owned, as I said all the time. Now they're all going to come under the Great Southern Railway. And the reason for their losses was, first of all, during the First World War, prices had gone up an awful lot. The cost of coal, the cost of wages, everything had gone up. The second thing was that during the Civil War, the Irish Civil War in 1922 and early 23, there was an awful lot of blowing up of bridges. The Republican side wanted to stop the trains going because the government forces were using the trains to bring their troops around the place, so they blew up the bridges. And they did awful destruction to the railway, and it had an awful lot of, a very bad effect on those. Now, there was no blowing up of the Tramore train. The Tramore train was far too small for anyone to be worried about, but the Tramore train got lumped in with the rest, and there were 25 different formerly privately owned railway lines, all now part of the Great Southern Railway Company. And the important point was that now control left Waterford, control of the Tramore train left Waterford, and the administration all came from Dublin. So we were absorbed into this conglomeration of railway lines who were losers really, and we were lumped in with them, and this I don't think was a good thing for our little railway line. Waterford was the hub for 6 different railway companies. I've already talked about the Tramore Waterford line, which was unique, but there was another line that came, well, the one we now have now, coming from Dublin, Kilkenny, Waterford. Then we have the one we have now from Limerick to Limerick Junction to Clonmel to Waterford. So that's 3. Then there was a train that came from Dublin down the east coast, and Macmine Junction came over to New Ross and into Waterford. That's 4. And then there was a train that went to Dungarvan, Kilmacthomas, Dungarvan, Cappoquin, Lismore, up to Fermoy, onto Mallow, and then you could go to Cork or Dublin from there. So all these lines were converging in on Waterford, and the last one, the Dungarvan line, when it came in, it had its station in Bilberry, because the metal railway bridge hadn't been built at that stage, and then when that was built, they closed that railway station and they brought the trains into Waterford. That was called Waterford South in Bilberry, Waterford North. And when I was growing up, it was always the North Station, the other side of the bridge. It's now called Plunkett Station, but the North Station was common usage when I was young, and it was a very important station. It's now down, shamefully. It's down to one platform, just one platform on our major railway station, with 2 lines: the Dublin line we know about and the Limerick Junction line. And the Limerick Junction line, the decision has been taken. We know has been taken to close that line. The reason they're not closing it now is that there's an election coming up, and they don't want to make an unpopular decision until after the election. But as soon as the election is over, you heard it here, the Waterford-Limerick Junction line is going to be closed because they're losing money. It's not the only one that's going to be closed, but it's the one that affects us most that's going to be closed. And the government of the day back in 2002 tried to close that line, and we managed. We, headed up by Waterford Chamber of Commerce, went to see the Minister for Transport of the day, Seamus Brennan, and he reversed the decision to close it and kept it open. But now it's come up again and they're going to close it. And I'm wondering, is anyone bothered in Waterford about it? Nobody was bothered about the closure of the Rosslare line. Regrettably, I think that should never have been closed. Sorry?
That was a heavy commuter line, the Rosslare line.
Not heavy enough.
Yeah.
People came from South Wexford, Campile and places like that, to Waterford to work, to go to college, to go to school and use it. But what kept it going was the beet harvesting. When the sugar companies were in operation, most of the beet, a lot of the beet, was sown and harvested in South Wexford, and it went to Wellington Bridge, where they had a very good facility for loading the wagons with sugar beet, which was brought up to Carlow and Mallow sugar factories. But when the sugar factories were closed down, then these train loads of beet didn't happen, and therefore there was less traffic on the Rosslare line. But the point I'm making is that not enough was done to fight these closures. And Waterford is losing out as a result. Waterford Port will lose out if the train from Limerick Junction to Waterford is closed, because that could be developed to bring goods down to the docks. Our docks in Waterford are very well placed because the train track runs right up beside the ship. Probably one of the only places in Ireland where that happens. And there are what they call liner trains going from the west of Ireland down to the docks here. But there could be more of those if that was developed. I think it should be. But anyway, to come back to the Tramore train, the fate of that was sealed when the government passed an act which said that if there was any uneconomic routes in the view of CIE, because Great Southern Railway by then had been transformed into the CIE, and if CIE decided that this route is uneconomic, they could close it. You can close it, the government said that, provided you put on alternative transport, and in this case alternative equals buses. And the warnings were there, everyone knew it was coming, and it was almost like burying the head in the sands because nobody did anything about it until finally they were told we're closing it at the end of the year. And they put together a delegation that went to Dublin to talk to the people in CIE and to try and negotiate things. And CIE said, we won't meet you unless you agree that we will not be discussing the railway. Imagine that. They went up and they couldn't discuss the railway, so they could only discuss alternatives to the railway. So they had no experts advising them. They had no strategy, no game plan, no alternative options to save the railway. And what happened? On the 31st of December 1960, the railway was closed. Now that railway was carrying 424,000 passengers a year. That's passenger journeys. So if I go out to Tramore, that's a journey, and I come back in, that's another journey. So 424,000, almost 500,000 passenger journeys were happening on the Waterford Tramore Railway. And that was far more than, say, the Cork Cove Railway, which they wanted to close as well around that time. But they didn't close the Cork Cove Railway. In fact, it took about 40 years for the Cork Cove Railway to have the same number as the Tramore Railway had in the 1960s. And why didn't they close the Cork Cove Railway? It was because the Cork people went out and they sat on the tracks and they refused to get up. And they didn't sit on the tracks leading to Cove, because the CIE would have let them sit there all day. They sat on the tracks leading to Dublin, and that is the busiest railway line in Ireland, the Cork-Dublin line, and they couldn't budge because the Cork boys were sitting on the tracks and wouldn't get up. And they caved in and said, right, we'll keep your train open for you. This could have been done in Waterford. We have a train going to Dublin. They could have sat on the tracks here. Not at all. They sat in their backsides and were very inefficient, I have to say. And the last day was the Saturday, the 31st of December, 1960. The last train ran in was the 2:10 from Tramore. There should have been other trains later in the day, but they cancelled those and put on buses instead because they were afraid that people would pick souvenirs off the trains and so forth. So they stopped the train earlier on. That was a Saturday. The locals in Tramore burned an effigy of Todd Andrews, who was the chairman of CIE, out in Tramore, but too late, it was gone. And on Monday morning, the 2nd of January, the men were out breaking up the tracks. And the crucial thing was the bridge, the railway bridge at Pickettstown, just a mile or two from Tramore. And it went over the road, and once that was gone, well then you were kind of, you couldn't possibly rebuild the train without the railway without the bridge. So that was the first thing to go. So why did they do this? They did it because the Tramore train was losing money. It was losing £3,000 a year, £3,000 a year. Now, with the number of journeys that I've just quoted, almost 500,000. All they had to do was add twopence to every journey, and they would have got their money, and they would have been in profit. But they didn't. They brought on buses, and they added 7pence to the cost of the bus. It's unbelievable what they were allowed to get away with. They took from us the train that we loved, and they love it to this day. People in Tramore get very emotional about their train that was taken from them. They loved the train, they took it from us, and they gave us buses, which we hated. And they charged us more for the buses. They should never have been allowed to get away with it. And if they'd only managed to have the ability to stall things, because in 1964 the government finally found, look, we can never make railways pay. We've got to subvent them. And they increased the subvention to the railways in 1964. So had they kept them going for a few more years, the chances are the Tramore train would have been saved. I'm not saying it would have been, but there would have been hope there. So just to repeat, there were 6 railways. There was the Tramore train, there was the Dungarvan train, there was the New Ross and the Rosslare, all gone. And the Dublin one, that's very busy and it's good service. And then there's the Limerick Junction, which is about to go. And again, nobody's doing anything about it. It's a bit like Tramore train all over again. I don't think anyone worries about the trains. I know for a fact that Ian Road Éireann have 22 trains idle. It was on the Independent, Sunday Independent. They have 22 trains idle in Dublin. You see, they bought lots of trains at the boom time because traffic was heavy and they felt this was going to continue. So they invested in trains. That didn't happen. We all know what happened with the boom. It burst. And traffic isn't as heavy as they thought it would be. And they have loads of carriages and loads of diesel trains available. It's costing them money to have 22 trains that are worth about 44 million. It's costing them money to have those doing nothing. Wouldn't somebody think of doing something with them? I think Tramore and Waterford particularly, was the hub of train traffic in the old days. It's now a mere shadow of its former self, and something should be done about it. I don't know if you want that kind of a rant with your. Does that fit in with your thing? We could edit it a bit, maybe.
Probably fit in it. I think it's important that something needs to be said. And kind of, at least the eye look back on the train, but maybe not looking at the facts that led to it being taken apart.
Of course, there's always two sides to everything, but there's a fair bit of knowledge in what I'm saying. Sorry, I'm just chatting now. Do you want to ask questions for the programme?
Do you have any particular personal memories of the Tramore train?
Oh yeah, we loved the Tramore train. There were very old carriages. The oldest carriage when they took it off was 90 years old. It's hard to believe, isn't it? And some of the engines were almost as old as that as well. They looked after them. And they bought them probably second-hand from someplace else. So it was an economically run thing. But the small little carriages, a lot of them, they weren't like through carriages. You couldn't walk from one carriage to the next. You couldn't even walk from one compartment to the next. Every carriage compartment had a door. You went in, and that's all you got to. Incidentally, the doors were only on one side. There were no doors on the other side, because when the train went to Tramore from Waterford, you got in on the right-hand side, we'd call it, and you got out on the right-hand side. So the platform was on the same side for both. So you didn't need doors on the other side. And if they bought second-hand ones that had doors, they cut the handles off them and closed them, locked them up. And then better ones came in. But if we were coming home from Tramore as a group, we might have been out there at the seaside, or we might have been out there at the tennis club playing tennis or whatever, and a group of us would get in and we'd have a great old sing-song in the train coming in. And there was great hijinks done. Some terrible, dangerous things that young fellas got into. For instance, as I said, each compartment you couldn't get to the next one, but some guys got into one and they knew there was girls in the next one. And while the train was moving, opened their door, went along the side of the train. You'd be horrified to see it in the movies, and got into the girls at the next thing. I mean, needless to say, I didn't do that, but there were fellows who did things like that. It was a lovely train. It was just lovely.
You don't know anyone who actually did that, so we could track him down and ask.
For my book about called The 5 Minute Bell, I interviewed a lot of people, and one guy told me that he did that. I just can't remember his name at the moment. And if I did have his name, I'd want his permission before I'd mention it in a film like this.
But, so the Tramore train was purely it wasn't a cargo, it was only people.
Oh, that's good question. They took goods as well. For instance, if Mrs. Jones was in Waterford and went to buy something, or they didn't have it and they said, we'll get it in and we'll send it out to you, it would come out in the train. So maybe a dress from Mrs. Jones, who lives in Tramore, we'll say, would come out by train, and the porter then would take it and deliver it to her house for her. So that was small parcels, if you like. But the bigger goods were obviously bringing coal for the gasworks. Tramore had its own gasworks next to the railway station and brought coal out there. And cattle and sheep and pigs were brought in, and even horses. So they had goods wagons, and they did do a certain amount of goods.
And was it a big commuter line, or was it? I assume there's a lot from people coming from Tramore to work in Waterford, or
yes,
kind of purely people going to Tramore for the beach.
No, both ways. A lot of people like to live in Tramore and would come in every morning in the train. Maybe in the summertime, some of them would cycle in. And depending which way the wind was blowing, if the wind was blowing this way, they might cycle in and come home in the train, bring the bike in the train. A lot of people obviously went to Tramore for the seaside. And people from non-Waterford people, we'll say from Kilkenny, from landlocked counties like Tipperary and Kilkenny and that, they'd come down by train to Waterford, walk the mile, or take a hackney, across town from the North Station, Plunkett Station now, to Railway Square, and hop on the train there. And you got one ticket, so the ticket did you from wherever you got on. Say you got on in Kilkenny, it said Kilkenny to Tramore. In brackets underneath, you have to walk from one station to the other in Waterford. We're not covering that bit.
And in your role in Waterford, growing up in Waterford, can you think of any big industrial changes or changes in shops and industry around the city centre?
Well, let's stay with the industry. The biggest industry that came to Waterford in my time was Waterford Glass. That's before it was called Waterford Crystal. It was called Waterford Glass. And I sat beside Karl Bachik, whose father came over from Czechoslovakia and brought and rejuvenated, if you like, brought over the know-how to rejuvenate glassmaking in Waterford, brought over some other people like Miroslav Havel to teach Waterford fellows how to blow and cut. And they started off in a tiny little place next to Kilcone Park. It was a Nissen hut. You know the Nissen huts that they used to have in the army days? It was kind of a corrugated iron shed. You'd see them in old war movies. And I remember going up after school to see the bacon the glass, and they'd pick up, some of the guys would pick up a bit of old glass that was spoiled, and and etch in Frank or something like, or your initials in it for you. Go home, pride is punch. But that's because we knew the boss's son sort of thing. We got up there for that. But then it moved into Johnstown, and then moved out to Kilbarry, and the rest is history, and was taken over. But it was a great achievement. It made Waterford famous. Waterford Crystal was certainly bought big time in America by people who didn't know where Waterford was. I didn't even much care where Waterford was. They loved Waterford Crystal. But tastes change, and time moved on. But Waterford Crystal was the big thing. Then, of course, the coming of industry. Some of the old industries, like bacon curing, sack and bag manufacturing, some of those things, they went down. The things that came up, we had a paper mill that was built in the 50s over on the other side of the river, up from the railway station at Granny. And that only lasted probably until late 1970s. And that was a big industry for water. Didn't last. Making of kitchens and things like that was here. But then the industrial estate was opened up, and the IDA brought in a foreign industry into Waterford. The likes of Milton Bradley and people like that came in. I actually worked for the IDA at one stage, and was mad keen on bringing in industry into Ireland to, frankly, get jobs for Irish people and not having them either on the dole or emigration to try and get work. And then I came back to Waterford in 1980 at the beginning of Bouch and Lom. So I was part of the team that went about creating a new company in Waterford at a time when people were very suspect of these foreign-sounding companies. Would they last at all? Remember the crowd, they didn't last very long. Well, Milton Bradley is still here, Bouch and Lom are still here and thriving, thank goodness. So that was good.
And as the last kind of summing up of things, can you think of any Waterford characters throughout the years growing up? Either not necessarily men of the roads, but them perfectly included, but characters that would have been known around town or noteworthy people.
Yeah. There was a mayor of Waterford, Power, and he was known as the bully man. Not because he was a bully, but quite frankly, I can't remember. You should ask somebody else the origins of the name, but he was the bully man, he was called. And there was a tradition in Waterford in my time that all the men in Ballybricken wore bowler hats, black bowler hats. And he would be one of those who wore a bowler hat around the place. You always knew a Ballybricken man because he wore a bowler hat, right? And of course, poor women wore shawls, and generally speaking, black shawls. I believe that sometimes they might smuggle a bottle of stout into the cinema under the shawl, you know. But the characters you're asking me about, there was a guy who sold newspapers called Wexford. He was known as Wexford. Ed Grace, I think, was his name, but nobody knew his name. His name was Ed Wexford, as far as they're concerned, because he was from Wexford. And there's a story told about a new McMaster, the famous Shakespearean actor, was appearing in the Theatre Royal. And they bring their company with them, but for small parts, they normally get local people to play small parts where you'd have no lines to say, just come in, do something, and go off. And the man, this particular night, the man who was going to do something like that didn't turn up. Consternation. Play was about to start, and Wexford happened to be around selling newspapers or something. They said to him, come in. And at a certain point, when we tell you, will you go onto the stage and hand this document to a new McMaster character, you see? Now, no one told him anything else, and poor Wexford, at the appropriate time, went on and handed the document. And a new McMaster, still in character, said, "What are you giving me here, you wretched man? I'll have you beheaded for this. Get him, catch him." You know, no one had told him this was a play and that he was part of it. And he said, "So sorry, sir. They only told me to give you this."